Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Murphy to Manteo, the podcast of the Highway 64 Project. Highway 64 Project is a collaboration between the Professional Writing and Rhetoric program at Elon University and the Environmental Studies Department. Highway 64 is a metaphor for the cross-section of North Carolina where we study community, culture, climate, resilience, and all things sustainability. Our guest today is Kimberley Campbell, one of the pioneers of the green burial movement. And we're going to ask her a lot of interesting questions about the work that she's been doing in recent decades, kind of spearheading this movement that's taken over all over the United States. With me today, as always, Caden Halberg, project manager for Highway 64, and Olivia Grady, the producer of the podcast. So, Olivia, I'll let you take it from here.
Yes, my name's Olivia. As Strickland said, I'm executive producer of the Highway 64 podcast. And with me is Caden. He helps run the website and all things technical side of the project of Highway 64. I'll let Caden introduce himself.
Yeah, as Olivia said, I'm the one behind the website and everything. I'm majoring in professional writing and rhetoric. I'm minoring in environmental studies. So this is really a nice fit for me because I'm able to, help work with the students who, in the professional writing side of things, the English side, who are writing stories, and also work with the environmental studies students who are looking into the larger environmental and climate stories across the region.
Yeah. I can get started with the first question. Kimberly, I've heard a lot of good things about you, and we're so excited to have you as a guest today on one of our, first episodes. And I feel like for the layman listeners, they don't know a lot about the green burial process. I didn't know too much about it before Strickland told me, and it's just very fascinating. So we just want to know if you could give the layman listener, sort of like a synopsis of what you guys do at Memorial Ecosystems at Ramsey Creek and the green burial process in general. So what exactly you do, what inspired you to begin, and why it's sort of better for the environment?
Well, that's a lot of questions right there. And I'm so happy to be here. And thank you so much for thinking of us and involving us in this project, which I think is so lovely. So in its basic form, this is a return to truly traditional burial. Basically, green burial has been out there since the year dot. A green burial, which meant no embalming, a hand-dug grave, and a simple container or wrapping in material, is really centuries and centuries old. This is nothing new. Over the centuries, and especially in the 20th century, we kind of lost the art of taking care of our own dead. And this is all related. I realize I'm not talking about the environment now, but it is all related. So, with losing that skill came the professionalization of everything. And so that's when we started using a lot more resources. I think if people knew how many resources we use. For example, steel. We use over 100,000 tons of steel, more than enough to build a Golden Gate Bridge each year. We use 20 to 30 million board feet of hardwoods for coffins and things. Concrete, which of course making concrete, how that is all, the energy that you put into those kind of resources, so obviously making concrete, that is also associated with CO2 emissions. We use 1.6 million tons. Copper and bronze, 17,000 tons. And embalming fluid, 3 million gallons. So when you start thinking, we tend to think of death as a very personal thing with our family and what we're doing. But when you multiply that over all these things, these numbers are kind of staggering when we do have other options. So that's kind of an overall thing. But basically, this was my husband's idea that he had been thinking about since he was a young boy. He had a wonderful teacher who was a little bit eccentric, just like the rest of us. And he would always talk about just wanting to be buried in a burlap bag and a tree to be planted over him. And I think Billy was about 8. Then Billy grew up in the woods. Here he's a family practice doctor. He came back to his hometown to practice medicine. So he always grew up in the woods, had always loved the environment, and I think dealing with death and dying issues on a daily basis. And then his interest in the environment and in the local community. He'd been involved in several other projects, creating South Carolina Forest Watch, which was monitoring timber harvesting on private and public land. and kind of expanding this into, gosh, I don't have all the money to buy all the land and kind of do good stuff with it. So he was thinking on those lines. And then when his own father died and he actually had to do the work, he was in his late 20s and kind of figuring out how to bury somebody, kind of brought into light, gosh, with what we spent on this, I could have purchased 5 acres of land and made this wonderful permanent memorial green space for my dad in memory of my dad. So it kind of came from that sort of this bigger outlook of, we need to protect more land. How can we do this functionally? And then on a very personal level. And then that he'd always been interested in the environment. He'd started taking restoration ecology, conservation biology, these things, and sort of following those movements. And actually, it was in a wonderful magazine called Orion, which is I know that many of you have heard of that there was an article in Orion about tall grass prairies and how we are losing that ecosystem. And some of the best remnants of tall grass prairie were old cemeteries. So Billy started thinking, well, gosh, if we can do this by accident, then with good design, with the modern tools that we have, with conservation biology, with restoration ecology, all of this work that scientists have been doing, couldn't we kind of create these places that would create living legacies and help people carry their love and respect for nature to the grave? It's also just kind of amazing how many, you've seen that kind of about the resources, but how much money we actually spend in the industry itself, between all the flowers, the funerals, the cemeteries themselves. I think we spend, let me see, it's up to $100 billion with all of that stuff. So this is kind of like looking at, well, with all that money that people are going to die. I mean, that's one thing we've all got in common, and it's going to happen. I know we all feel immortal on certain days, but it is going to happen. And so somehow if we can redirect at least even 10% of that money into what we call CPR for the land, conservation, preservation, restoration, what a powerful tool that becomes. And so in a roundabout way, I probably garbled on too much, but that's sort of the gist of it.
Kimberley, could you elaborate just very briefly on the actual burial process, exactly what you do there?
Yes. So we accept both whole bodies for natural burial, and we also accept cremated remains. For natural burial, first of all, it is possible for people to take care of their own dead if you're not using embalming, but it just takes a lot of support and a lot of commitment from the people who will be responsible for that. Sometimes it's easy to talk about it. When it actually happens, things sometimes fall apart. We have developed relationships with various funeral homes, though, and who offer much more reasonable pricing, and also more of a basic approach to the care of the body. So they are literally responsible for picking up the deceased, storing them with refrigeration to replace the embalming. They can provide a casket or shroud, or you can make your own. A casket is not required. But it's whatever level people want to get involved with that. And then they do the death certificate, the burial removal transit permit, and then transport the deceased to the preserve for burial. For us, what we do is the preparation of the grave. We dig the graves about 3 feet deep, and the sites are just like a little bit bigger than either the casket or the person. So we dig them 3 feet deep. The soil is taken off in layers. So we take the duff layer off on the top. That is placed in one pile. Then we take the topsoil. That's placed in another pile on tarps. And then we remove the subsoil. We hand dig these graves. We do not use machinery. And then we line the grave with cedar. We place either the casket or the person on top of that. In the case of a shroud burial, we cover them with more greenery to kind of create air pockets, which help a lot with the decomposition process and absorbing moisture and things like that. And then we put the soil back in the way that we took it out. So we end up with a mound which protects against animals. And with us, we have fairly thick, heavy clay soils with a lot of rock here. So a lot of times there'll be rock in the grave, and we can maintain the grave with those rocks. But essentially, it's like being 6 feet under, but you are closer to the living layer. Also, when we hand dig the graves, we find most families are usually involved with that process with closing. When we have taken the soil out shovelful by shovelful, it goes back in a lot easier, rather than if we used a piece of equipment where you get a big old clump and it kind of sort of sticks together. So that's kind of that process.
And are the graves marked in a traditional way?
So what we do is we use rocks which we find from the preserve. We have our own sandblaster, and so we engrave the rocks with names and birth and death dates. We lay these flat, like with a little place underneath where it's a home for critters and stuff like that, and also ants. And for ant colonies, ants help spread like 95% of wildflower seeds. So they're very important. So these are not markers that stand up like we're used to seeing. They really do have an ecological purpose. And they're it's all from Ramsey Creek. Now, we do have people that live locally in the area who are part of the same, we're actually in the Brevard zone, but they're in the same sort of geological area, and they have a special rock at their house or something. And if it's appropriate, we will use that for the marker. So, yeah, they are marked. And we also use, back in the day when we started this in 1996, 1998, there was no Google Earth. There was barely websites, and there were definitely no cell phones and the kind of tools that we have today. So we actually hired somebody with a small plane with an infrared camera. They flew over the property, took 2-foot contours. We developed a trail system. We got a surveyor out there to do fixed survey marker points along the trails. In the old days, sounds like the Middle Ages, we would use a compass and a tape measure. So we would pick where the grave was, we would pick the closest surveyed marker and do a compass and a tape measure reading. As things developed, GIS kind of came on board, and there were some people at Clemson who were working with that. We got involved with them. They developed an algorithm for that compass and tape measure reading. We were able to develop a GIS map. And now, of course, GPS has improved so much more and is so much more readily available. And with other things, we can use that. So when people are buried, that is a thing people say, well, how am I going to find somebody in the woods? This just looks like the woods to me. So I like to sort of mix art and science. So I like to sort of write a lyrical description. So it's sort of like over the river and through the woods to grandmother's grave we go. So go to the little chapel, take the North Ridge Trail behind, past marker 11, and go 5 paces, and to the right you'll see this, and then you've got the scientific part where if that fails, here's the GPS things. So people can be found readily, and the other thing I think that is different is we try not to use the word cemetery, even though we have a cemetery function, because it's one of those things where we have, with the ritual that has developed with cemeteries, people expect one thing. And it just in their brain, kind of the visual picture of a cemetery, what it looks like, what they're used to seeing, and the rituals that go along with that, how we treat the dead and kind of that process. So when you just say nature preserve, it just changes the whole dynamic. And it is kind of looking at the other side of the coin and approaching it from the nature point of view rather than kind of the established thing that we have.
So you were just talking about how this, you started this in 1996 and it's now 2025. So you've been doing this for a very long time. Have you noticed that the people who choose to be buried in this way have they chosen to do this for similar reasons as since when you started, or have the reason they want to get buried like this, has it changed, much? Is it more concerned about environmental consciousness or anything like that, I guess?
It's so interesting. That's such a good question, Hayden, because we have found that people come to this from a variety of different angles. One is expense. And actually, I think if you start thinking about this, why was it in the beginning of the 20th century, we didn't have cremation, basically, and unless it happened by accident kind of thing. But, I mean, obviously in Indian culture, but cremation as we know it now, what kind of changed the process? And basically it was land, expense, and simplicity. And so people, this whole way that we had of burying people with the embalming and the concrete vaults and all of this stuff didn't kind of ring true with people. Maybe not with all people. I mean, there are some people that really appreciate this and it is very meaningful to them. I'm not, that's great. But why did cremation pick up and become so popular when we had this other thing? So like I said, for a lot of people, we have found the expense. Most people end up spending on average between $12,000 to $17,000 for a whole body burial by the time you've paid the funeral home costs and the cemetery costs. With us at Ramsey Creek, depending on if people manage it themselves or how they use the funeral home, it can be between $5,000 to $7,000. So that is still a chunk of change, but it is a significant savings. And it's what sort of the whole ability to be able to come and visit, and what people, part of their living legacy is kind of helping to create these nature preserves that people in the local community can walk and enjoy and learn about nature and just have a wonderful, peaceful spot for contemplative thought, or some Winnie the Pooh pondering, I like to call that, so it benefits the community that way. But also kind of the land issue for a lot of people, standalone. Remember, in this day and age, churches don't build cemeteries anymore. At Joni Mitchell's They Paved Paradise and Put Up a Parking Lot is really a true song. And, most of the churches are bigger now, and they have parking lots because we all have cars. And so a lot of these standalone cemeteries are not associated with one particular place of faith. In the old days, people would go to their little churches and there would be the graveyard joining them. So it all kind of worked in the community, and the church did good stuff in the community and you were buried there. But now so you had a connection with it. Now a lot of the standalone cemeteries are zoned in commercial areas near busy roads. The vegetative management is somewhat controlled and more open, so they can get more burials in there. They also, usually do 800 to 1,000 per acre. In some cases, they double stack in metropolitan areas, so you can get up to 2,000 bodies per acre. Maintain that. They want that sort of flat golf course look with flat markers, so it's more easy for their type of vegetative management. So, and for example, our density will be in the first 36 acres, 1,500 burials, because we are guided by what we have on the land and the topography, steeper slopes, heavily wooded areas, places of plants that might be more sensitive that shouldn't be disturbed. So, and then the sort of the simplicity of things. In the old days, people, when they took care of their own dead, it was fairly simple. But this kind of ritual that has developed, and also I think where people are hands off, it used to be in the old days, people were very involved. They would hand dig the grave, they built coffins, they sat up with the dead and kept awake. Now you're just kind of out there in limbo land, just kind of letting everybody else take care of everything. So there's a sense of disconnection, that disconnect with death, that the ritual that we've been used to has sort of lulled us into this sense of things. So we have found with our system that people can make the caskets, the shrouds, they help close the grave, be part of all of that. I think part of it is you're moving and walking, you're using endorphins. That always kind of makes you feel good. Not that I'm saying people feel good at a funeral. There's also the amount of fear involved with death and thinking, gosh, this is something new that I'm not used to. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. And they get through it and they've done it and they've been part of it. And it's been okay. And not only was it okay, it turned out being something that was beautiful and peaceful and calm and, and then I think it sort of seems to help and ease the grieving process, facing those fears and also having a bit of control back. It wasn't like you gave it to somebody else to do. You did it. You were there, you contributed.
Yeah, definitely. And that sort of bleeds into the question that I wanted to ask, because I feel like with the funeral industry and with like typical practices of a funeral and of a burial process, it's just something that we're so used to. Like, I know before Strickland told me about this, I didn't even know what a green burial process was. Like, in learning about it, I find it so interesting. And, you're right. Like, that disconnect from death and a typical practice, this really sort of grounds you into your loved one or whoever you're doing this practice for. For people like even me or anyone who's sort of like interested to learn more about something like this, what would you say are the typical like hesitancies that people have, like, or common questions or concerns that you find from people when they're sort of looking into something like this?
So the three questions we get the most: what is this going to do to the water? Am I going to be dug up by wild animals? And when you die, how will this carry on? So as far as the animals, the mounding of the graves really, protects against this. We have a game cam down by the creek where we have captured bear, coyotes, packs of hunting dogs that have gotten loose, beavers, otters, bobcats, foxes. So this really is about going wild when you die. I mean that, hopefully, literally and figuratively. So, but we have these animals, and we've been doing this, like I said, now for close to 28 years. And also we've helped other people across the country in different states. And nobody has experienced an animal coming up and digging up the deceased. I think people have watched a lot of those crime shows where there's somebody's been in the woods, and we kind of associate it with that. But we really do take measures against that. So, that's the whole thing with that. With the water quality issue, this is the whole thing that kind of happened with the embalming. We've also come to think that when somebody dies, it's almost like we treat the body like it's nuclear waste, And so embalming had sort of become associated with sanitation, that somehow the body needed sanitizing, which it doesn't. Embalming is actually not required in any of the 50 states for any reason whatsoever. And in fact, if you've got certain diseases like a prion-based disease like Jakob Creutzfeldt or Ebola or something like that, the worst thing you can do is start messing around with the body. You should put it in a body bag or in a container and bury it or burn it as soon as possible. So, but the thing is with water is, first of all, out in the wild, there's all sorts of effluent that ends up in creeks. Beavers, where we are, cows, sort of industrial pollution going into the water, effluent from chicken houses, etc., from people putting stuff on their fields and it washing down. Most of us get our water from municipal water supplies that have already gone through that process of cleansing it and making it palatable. And so the water quality issue is kind of really, I don't know if people think it's more of a Ganges type project and there'll be bodies floating down or whatever, but that is not a concern. And then, of course, the whole thing about, well, what happens if you die? How does this carry on? And this is where the conservation part is so important. So, as we said before, simple green burial around from the year dot and has been practiced, up until the 20th century. But what conservation burial is, so our land is all under easement with Upstate Forever. They are the largest land trust in the upstate of South Carolina. They cover 11 counties. They do incredible work for conservation. And so we have a detailed agreement with them about the basic standards and guidelines for conservation burial. So the density, how the graves are dug, the vegetative management, that it's only native plants that we use where we know where they're sourced from and that they are site specific. The visitation, the visitor management, we've done all of these things to really protect long term the land. And so when we die and another entity purchases this and carries on with it, that easement acts as a deed restriction on the land. So that manages how it will be managed in perpetuity. It won't be able to be managed any other way. If the other owners managed it in a different way, we are inspected by the land trust. They would sue them, and we would also be able to bring in the family members of the people who are buried there already, who have stated through their contract, we want to be buried in a functioning nature preserve overseen by these standards and guidelines. So it becomes a very powerful litigious tool to make sure that this we keep true to our standards.
I want to say, in terms of full disclosure, that Kimberly is a dear old friend of mine that I haven't talked to in quite some time. And when I was brainstorming with my students about topics for upcoming podcasts, I said, no, get outside the box. Let's think very innovatively. And somebody pitched the idea of green burial, and a couple of people asked questions about it. They didn't know about it. And I said, I just happen to know somebody who was one of the original pioneers of this whole thing. Let's reach out and see if she'd be willing to talk to us. So this has been fantastic. I know I've been a real eye-opener for Olivia and Caden, and for me too. And I'm hoping that the viewers of this podcast will walk away from this with some new thoughts about this whole concept of natural burial. And it's because of you that these kinds of places are now available in lots of states. It's not just your little corner of the upstate of South Carolina. You've created a movement, as Olivia said, and we really appreciate that, and we appreciate you being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, my friends. It takes a village, and it takes people talking about things. It's difficult to talk about death, but I think there are ways of making things. Let's hope we can make it a good death for everybody, and a good death which makes the planet better for the planet as well.
Well said. Thank you, Kimberly, for viewing another episode of From Murphy to Manteo. We'll see you again next time.